Okay, hello, 27 January. Welcome to Dis and Datinformation, the Autonomous Collective.net, and we're continuing what we sort of started on the weekend with chapter 6 of Capital Volume 1, the 2024 edition. And yes, even with a new translation, it's a little convoluted. Marx is trying to explain certain types of equivalences when you talk about, and it is a kind of rationalization about the transfer of certain things, value from in terms of labor, and a kind of sort of retaining a prior logic, Ricardo's logic mainly, and that's what's taken up by Steve Keen in his 1993 article, which, yes, it's 1993, but it kind of explains an entire generation of difference between sort of the so-called new interpretation of of sort of Marxist capital theory and other things, and it's just like academia to trouble over these matters, but it essentially summarizes a whole volume of issues that are still there, because we still live in a continuing reality, although it's hard to believe that, considering that today is the first new golfing day for the for Trump. He was playing golf today, but he rationalizes it by saying, "Well, I played golf before a meeting with congressional Republicans about the his tax cutting." So he managed to squeeze a round of golf, at least one round of golf in today. Noting, of course, that over 365 days of golf dates occurred during the Trump first term. In other words, a quarter of his administration was spent playing golf. Just remember that, because there are going to be more of them. Okay, so much for that idea of value. Remember, I introduced this idea in a table comparing constant capital and variable capital in columns 2 and 3, and columns 4 and 5 are comparing fixed capital with circulating capital. And that may seem, it's what's in a word. They're very different. In comparing constant and variable capital, you have to remember something that's constant uh, includes raw materials, machinery, buildings, existing value transferred to the final product, and variable capital is about labor power. And that difference between labor and labor power is what gets Marx away from or moves beyond Ricardo. The idea that it's not the actual physical labor, but it is the capacity for labor or the expectation of labor that is part of the idea of creating value. And remember, value is just another level of abstraction. And while, yes, we live in a world that's pretty concrete, but that is, material matter, etc. But we do, value is important. It allows us to make certain kinds of decisions, to decide that someone who spends a quarter of their time playing golf um, is actually kind of an important value to consider for a variety of reasons. Now, but the difference in the first sense, that is comparing constant capital with variable capital, is between labor, non-labor inputs, and labor power, and not labor itself. You see, there's already abstraction is going on, so you need to sort of get that sense of why Marx went there in the first place. Well, he went there because he didn't want to be like Ricardo, to sort of reduce things to things that aren't reducible. I mean, abstract things occur. Humans think. Humans interact and behave in ways that are, well, we could say not natural, but humans react in a kind of cultural way. They form culture, they do things. There's a lot of intention going on. It's not simple barter. We do things for a variety of reasons. We give people gifts for a variety of reasons. We don't always necessarily expect the same thing out of them. I mean, half of one's well, anyway. And comparing fixed capital to circulating capital is a different way. It's at scale. We're thinking about, well, time passes. Time occurs in constant versus variable capital, but fixed capital and circulating capital already emphasizes certain temporal and spatial things that go on: durability and use, whether things are long-lasting assets versus short-term assets, tangible assets versus intangible assets. It allows us to think about these other things that are going on that are labor related. Clearly, still labor related. All of these things are still connected together. The problem in the analysis is that people often sort of isolate or bracket various elements and then say, well, it's not that, or it's only this. But the reality, and you have to think dialectically, that these things are all integrated in useful and interesting ways. There's no waste in that particular sense. So fixed capital is value gradually transferred over the lifespan. That's like machinery, right? It's how we think about, and ultimately it pivots on issues of amortization, depreciation, those kinds of ways in which we treat value. Even in a capitalist economy, accounting measures occur. And the problem, of course, is that there's always this demarcation, even in the large language models that Gemini plays with. When you use the word Marxism, it automatically triggers an entire, language response that is not fully integrated. Although that's why I use a Gemini, is to see, well, how is it integrating, sort of two bodies of thought, two discourses, as it were. And so if you're comparing fixed capital and circulating capital, remember, we've talked about circuits of capital from volume 2 of Capital, because there's multiple circuits of capital. That's just how capital operates. So in the case of machinery and buildings, the value is gradually transferred over the lifespan. It's assessed value for land, depreciation over X amount of time, replacement value, repairs, stuff like that. Now, that's for a complete cycle, a set of cycles, the whole family of cycles. Whereas in circulating capital, not unlike labor power, and not unlike labor itself, is that the entire value is transferred in one cycle. That is, now cycles can be, there are different kinds of cycles, right? There are quarterly cycles, yearly cycles, etc. But circulating capital gives you this sense of the motion that's involved. So these two bodies of things, that is constant variable and fixed circulating, have family resemblance. There's an overlap between the two. In fixed capital and circulating capital, temporal and spatial elements are involved. And wages, of course, are involved in both. But we have to consider kind of the transition of materials, right? In circulating capital, raw materials are transformed. And in constant capital, they sort of stay where they are. It's really about, in constant and variable capital, it's about the wages. So there are different levels of abstraction of wages that are shared between the two pairs of capital. Now, the point I'm trying to make, and this is one that's a post-structuralist, as it were, what's being measured from an abstract point of view, the commodity that is being compared here, is difference itself. And of course, if Marx had spent a little bit more time doing math, he would think about that difference can be a commodity as well. And in fact, we do that. I mean, that is what we do. We measure differences. Differences become commodified in advanced capitalism. People play with that as a commodity. Why else would there be discrimination against people on the basis of their identity if it weren't about difference? Some people make money from it, right? Uh, a lot of people make money from it, and it becomes, problematic, right? How much is a passport worth in that sense? And I'm hoping uh, that other people get that worked out because it is problematic, highly problematic. And the whole question of barriers to migration are at risk, considering that taxpayer dollars, $852,000 for a single military flight of 80 Colombians uh, from I don't know, San Diego, I think, uh, to Colombia is a little pricey, considering that ICE, does the same flight for about $8,000. So you can just see what's going on, at least in the United States. All right, so I asked Gemini, uh, and so I'll do this Gemini thing. This is what Gemini says. Constant capital refers to the non-human inputs in production, such as machinery and raw materials, while variable capital pertains to labor costs. And that's kind of our simple way of thinking about it. Constant, something doesn't move around a lot, and labor is always moving. In contrast, fixed capital includes long-term assets that are not consumed in production. So it is something that doesn't move around a lot, but it's also the question of how it's being used. So there's a bit of motion or movement through space and time. Whereas circulating capital, so we're talking about constant versus variable, fixed versus circulating. Whereas circulating capital consists of inputs that are used up in the production process, like raw materials and labor. Labor is used up as well. So you can see that it's the same, only different. And it is that kind of difference that's actually kind of important. Um, so I asked Gemini to give us a little thing, and it did it. Constant capital C refers to the portion of capital invested in the means of production. Remember, MP, means of production, raw materials, machinery, tools, and land. Now, land is, a big variable, right? It doesn't move around. It's just there, terrestrially speaking, and gets even crazier when you think about, well, there's water on top of land, and that's a whole nother set of issues. Key characteristic, its value remains relatively unchanged during the production process. Well, water is not quite like that. It transfers its value to the final product without itself increasing in value. And then there's variable capital. Remember, constant versus variable. Uh, Variable capital represents the portion of capital invested in labor power, not labor itself, but labor power. Remember, labor power is the move that Marx makes away from Ricardo's more, simplified, as it were, idea about labor. Key characteristic, its value increases during the production process. Workers create more value than they're paid in wages, generating surplus value for the capitalist. That's the simple, easily explainable, relatable, clearly, to workers. I mean, that's just, if you're presenting a reason for unionization, for organizing, that's it. But you see, the reality is it's a part of a much larger thing. Workers don't just care about wages, hopefully, they care about other stuff, benefits, sustenance. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and wages just simply are a sign of that. So anyway, now on to fixed versus circulating. Fixed capital is capital invested in long-term assets used repeatedly in the production process. So it's a little more specific in the sense of the idea of use, and it refers to not so much things like land, although land is used repeatedly, machinery, buildings, and durable equipment. And that idea, this idea of fixed versus circulating is just a different sort of spin on the idea of capital, um, and does not refer in that particular way to the thing that ultimately we're going to get onto, and that is, rent, interest, all kinds of other matters. But those are outside of this simple descriptive division. And of course, where we are in the reading that we've been plowing through of the 2024 Volume 1, Karl Marx, Capital, the new translation, the Princeton translation. The key characteristic for fixed capital is values transferred gradually to the product over its lifespan, is not fully consumed in a single production cycle. So this idea of production cycles becomes important. That's the differentiating feature of it. You've now defined space and time relative to constant and variable capital. So in the first case, you've just sort of identified the things. In the second, you've seen it kind of working through a kind of, as it were, production cycle, which is also an exchange process, if you want to think about it that way, because it's more like Department 2 than it is Department 1. Let's think of it that way. And even though, production is a single department, there are features that are shared in Department 1 and Department 2. And that's kind of what Marx is trying to work through. He's trying to go, well, how am I going to account for stuff going on, variables? Are they dependent? Are they independent? Are they mediating? Yeah, et cetera. Circulating capital, the other part, is that capital that is used up or transformed in a single production cycle. So you're measuring the kind of activity that's going on. Now, whether it's use or exchange is the thing that a lot of Marxists like to argue about. And in fact, with all due respect, that's the kind of Heinrich Moseley problem, is that, well, how much of it is used up and how do you identify it, and other things, because then it gets you into this ugly place about surplus value. What's being cleaved off? And what's being exploited or what's being appropriated. You have all those things going on at the same time, and they don't necessarily exist in the same cycle, but they're connected. These cycles are connected. In other words, if you think of the cycle as one big cycle, but it's composed of little nested cycles, that's kind of what the economy is. It's like this big thing, and they got all these other little things moving on in it. Otherwise, you can't account for it. Marx is good in the sense that he's trying to figure out a structure. Why is it that all these things sort of fit together? How is it that it moves forward like in a nice dialectic way? And in fact, they do. I mean, it is how people operate. They do, you have to sort of accept the idea that, yeah, there's, a dialectic thing is, people can frame it in a different way, but dialectic helps us to explain certain kinds of elements. It explains why a lot of people act stupidly. So, just for that alone, you can see what's happening. But anyway, circulating capital used up or transformed in a single production cycle, such as raw materials, wages, considering circulating as it's used to purchase labor power that is a commodity. So in this particular context, this is wages used in a cycle in order to get to hire people. So there's this commodification of labor power. And then ultimately, of course, because you don't have labor power without people, it's still connected to people. But even though it's slightly abstracted, it is a capacity or a set of expectations that comes with constraints, of course, hours, safety, a bunch of other things. So, and then fuel, of course. And in that sense, fuel, because it usually comes from land somehow, carbon, etc., it's there. Just don't make yourself crazy about it. Key characteristics: its value is fully transferred to the product in each production cycle. And this is the simple version of it, right? If you're making a plastic widget of some kind, there's a whole bunch of things going on. There's a variety of chemicals, a variety of processes, a variety of machines. So it's, stuff's going on. And a production cycle is filled with all of those things, a plumbus, as Rick and Morty would say. It needs to be constantly replenished. And that's the other issue, that it's always moving. It can't, even in the case of land needs to be replenished. And that's the whole thing why Marx goes off into, soil science, etc. Key difference is the focus. And it is about focus or concentration or framing or point of view, however you want to, perspective. Constant and variable capital focuses on the source and behavior of value during production. Fixed and circulating capital focuses on the lifespan and usage patterns of capital assets. So they're kind of, the same similar things are being sort of observed, but from a different perspective, and in fact, at different moments And it is that question of moments that ultimately becomes important. Now, where it gets crazy is the relationship. Constant capital can include, this is where it gets, include both fixed capital and circulating capital. That it is, you could see that, yeah, machinery, yeah, raw materials. So constant capital can include these things. And variable capital, of course, is also considered part of circulating capital. It is. It just, you can see that from above, hopefully. So, in summary, these concepts, this is Gemini, are crucial in understanding how capital functions within the production process. They help to analyze, and this is the point I was just making a moment ago, the creation of surplus value, how labor generates value beyond its cost, and the role of technology, how the use of machinery, fixed capital, impacts production, the dynamics of capital accumulation, how capitalists reinvest profits to expand production. So there's other things at work, other than this particular activity that we see in the black box or in the factory or whatever. Now, people, there's just other ways of talking about it, auxiliary materials, instruments of labor, blah, 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 blah. And it gets a little crazy. Now, and when we get back to the linen question, of course, Marx tries to deal with it in the sort of gelatinous blob problem, sort of. It doesn't suffice, however, to express the specific character of the labor that makes up the linen's value. Human labor power in its fluid state, in other words, human labor creates value, but isn't itself value. See, that's that concrete abstraction separation. It becomes value in it. And this is the problem of the use of the word coagulated, like blood, coagulated state in an objective form. In order for the linen value to be expressed as a gelatinous blob of human labor, it must be expressed as something that has, quote unquote, objecthood, or something that is different from the linen as a physical thing, but at the same time is common to both the linen and another commodity. The problem has already been solved. Now, no, it hasn't been solved. You have to sort of ask the question of what goes on when liquids become solid, because that's kind of what's going on with coagulation and gelatinous stuff, right? It is sublimation. I know that's a big word, but it's just chemistry. When liquids become solids, you have to just sort of accept this idea that, kind of how stuff works. And you want to sort of get into the idea that the division between these things is not as clear or clean. And so that's what's sort of going on. Now, we can get crazy about this. And that's, when we start talking about the other volumes of capital, you can see how the single idea of essence, appearance, and actuality are kind of at work. And I won't go through this. Higginbottom does a much better job of it than I do. As we'll see later on, when Higginbottom starts I assume he's going to do a series on volume 3 of Capital, and we'll kind of plow through that with him in the fall. But you might want to read Chris Arthur's work before that. And then there's equations, and there's a description of surplus value. And yes, there is a Department 3. And we don't even want to go there. Let's not worry about that. Try not to worry about it anyway, because we're still sort of around, volumes 1 and 2. But as I said before, an article from 1993, Use Value, Exchange Value, and the Demise of Marx's Labor Theory of Value. And this is what we'll conclude with today, but we'll take a little time to read it, is Steve Keen's article, which is a good article because it sort of spells out sort of that moment where you have to sort of leave the labor theory of value not necessarily behind, because I think as a heuristic, well, is it a heuristic? Is it necessary for the analysis? I think it's necessary for introducing the analysis. Let's put it that way. It sort of needs to be set in its historical place, because as we've read volume 1 of Capital, as well as reading other Marxist stuff, it's kind of, Capital's the technical manual for, the manifesto, among other documents. You want to say, okay, somebody really wants you to get down and explain, how am I being exploited? this is the technical manual. You go, okay, this is what's happening. This is why, you get screwed every time you get your paycheck. And, there are organizing reasons for having this kind of connection, because I think that for anyone who sort of trolls you and says, well, you need to explain this further, well, this is the way you explain it further. But then to speak as an academic, there's just more stuff there. There is a science there somewhere, and it's worth doing. But at certain moments, you have to move past Newtonian physics and get to Einstein, because that's kind of what's going on here. It is this idea, it's not all Euclidean. There's non-Euclidean stuff going on, and and this happens in most sciences, that you have this one thing that's going on, which is important, biology, but then you have this other stuff that's going on that you have to sort of account for. That is, the physics of it, which is problematic. It still is problematic, and not to do the physics of it. But anyway, Steve Keen's article. Marx was the greatest champion of the labor. And note, of course, that I read some of this yesterday. So yes, it is repeating it, but I'm going to dig further into it today, so that hopefully you'll understand why an article from 1993 actually explains pretty much the divisions within sort of Marxist theory that kind of it may be divisions, but I think it's just perspectives. Let's put it that way. Some of us simply prefer to look at various things, and of course acknowledge that historically, Marxism itself had to go through these kinds of processes. Now, there are a lot of people who just simply want to re-argue certain things, and they require refinement. And that's part of, kind of the community of scholars working. And the moment of incommensurability, if you use the Thomas Kuhnian model, the moment of incommensurability, at least at one moment in the history of Marxism, is on the labor theory of value. You need to sort of reconcile it. You need to say, you acknowledge that it exists. It's there. It is a way of explaining one level of the theory. But note, of course, that everything is kind of moving forward and further on. And history is slightly different, even though some things have remained the same. Trump still plays golf. Marx was the greatest champion of the labor theory of value. The logical problems with this theory have, however, split scholars of Marx into two factions: those who regard it as an indivisible component of Marxism, and those who wish to continue the spirit of analysis begun by Marx without the labor theory of value. Now, without doesn't mean total negation of it. As I've just tried to point out, is that Newtonian physics still exists. It's just that we've moved on because the scale has changed to Einstein, plus, etc., quantum, blah, blah, blah. In the debate between these two camps, the former has attempted to draw support from Marx's concepts of value, while the latter has ignored them, taking instead as their starting point the truism that production generates a surplus. Now, those of us who are more ecumenical say, well, value is still involved, and that's where people get crazy, because, well, value means this. No, value means that. Well, it is actually about our arguing about value that we get to value, but anyway. However, a careful examination of the development of Marx's logic points out a profound irony that after a chance rereading of Hegel, Marx made a crucial advance, which should have led him to replace the labor theory of value with a theory that commodities in general are the source of surplus. Marx's value analysis is thus consistent, not with those who would defend the labor theory of value, but with those who would transcend it. And that's very Hegelian in that particular sense. However, Marx did not properly apply this analysis to non-labor inputs, while the cornerstone of capital was the correct application of the same analysis to labor. This unjustified asymmetrical treatment of the labor and non-labor inputs, labor inputs and non-labor inputs to production, is therefore the true and unsound foundation of Marx's labor theory of value, and with it corrected, the labor theory of value collapses. Early Marx, the labor theory of value. Marx did not spring immediately to the labor theory of value. As Mendel observes, his process of conversion began with his study of the English classical political economists, and the concept did not come easily. This is evident early on in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, where Marx makes the comment that, quote, the capitalist makes a profit first on the wages and secondly on the raw materials advanced to him, unquote. However, he shortly afterwards says that, quote, the greater the human share in a commodity, the greater the profit of dead capital, unquote, which is an assertion that labor is at least the major source of profit. Further on in the manuscript, Marx develops an acceptance of the idea that labor is the only source of wealth. Subsequently, Marx took the labor measure of value approach one stage further than had Ricardo to explain the source of surplus. By the time of Wage, Labor, and Capital, it's a shorter pamphlet, Marx gave the explanation that labor is paid its cost of subsistence, yet its work extends beyond the time required to reproduce those means of subsistence. He later formalized this using the distinction between labor power, the ability to perform work, and labor itself. Capitalists purchase labor power by paying for its cost of production and receive the far greater quantity of its ability to produce value. Quote, this is Marx, the worker receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power, but the capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence labor the productive activity of the worker, the creative power whereby the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but gives to the accumulated labor a greater value than it previously possessed. So this is trying to account for, what's all that? Where does surplus come from? What is surplus? The concept of use value was also the concept of use value. The concept of use value was also undergoing development at the early stage of Marx's introduction to political economy. As with the labor theory of value, Marx's initial understanding of use value was quite different than his final understanding. In the course of a powerful insight into the conflict between Ricardo and Malthus, Marx expressed in dialectical garb the opinion that use determines value, which is hardly consistent with the labor theory of value. Having criticized Ricardo and Say for forgetting in the debate over thrift versus luxury that, quote, there would be no production without consumption, unquote, he continues, quote, that it is use that determines the thing's value, and that fashion determines use, unquote. Now, remember, this is all 1844, and, Marx is evolving. He's got another 2 decades to sort of work through this problem. However, by the time he came to part company with Proudhon, Marx had imbibed the classical attitude that use value plays no role in determining value. This is the exchange emphasis. Marx's critique of Proudhon's reasoning is an interesting portent of his later developed approach to the distinction between use value and exchange value. While he rightly dismisses Proudhon's attempt at dialectics, it could well be that Proudhon laid the seed, which later germinated in the Grundrisse. Remember, the Grundrisse is another preliminary document, but important in terms of sort of revisionist approaches to Marx from a humanist point of view. According to Marx, the gist of Proudhon's attempt at a dialectic was that things of the lowest utility have the highest value, while those with the highest utility have the lowest value, and labor value provides a reconciliation between these two extremes. Now, this is kind of a simplistic view, but you need to sort of work through this. Marx dismissed this firstly as ignoring the role of demand, right, Department 2, in determining scarcity, and secondly, as dressing up in complicated terms the precise, clear, and simple language of Ricardo in order to arrive at the determination of relative value by labor time. The determination of value by labor time is, for Ricardo, the law of exchange value. For Proudhon, it is the synthesis of use value and exchange value. So you look at this is a difference in emphasis between Ricardo, Proudhon, and then Marx. Thus, at this stage, Marx admits that use value is a determinant of demand, but the concept plays no active role in his logic, because it's Department 2. Don't worry about that. We're just doing Department 1. He is firmly of the opinion that all which is necessary to form the foundation of political economy can be analysis of exchange value. Now, that's kind of a simplification, and we sort of have to say, well, Marx is still working through this. The dialectic of the commodity. Several authors have observed that a chance rereading of Hegel had a profound effect on Marx while he was drafting the Grundrisse. Mendel observes that the Hegelian dialectics evidently lay behind many of the dialectical pairs, such as commodity and money, use value and exchange value, capital and wage labor, labor time and leisure, labor and wealth, in which the Grundrisse abound. So remember, the Grundrisse happens after the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. So the Grundrisse um, has some developments, and we need to sort of accept all of these things as part of the interpretation rather than sort of doing a kind of retconning, which that's oversimplifying the role of Althusser, but it's kind of important to think about that. The most potent of these was the dialectic between use value and exchange value, and the realization of the role it could play in political economy. It was first expressed in a footnote spanning 2 pages of the Grundrisse. Here, Marx first realized that the classical treatment of the commodity provided the means by which he could unite his German dialectical philosophy with English classical political economy. So you can see what's going on. He's not just sort of making stuff up. He's saying, well, okay, I'm a pragmatist. I've got this whole German dialectic thing that, it's past the dissertation stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm in England, or at least in France, preparing to go to England or back and forth. And now I've got to sort of deal with what really is going on. Is not value to be conceived as the unity of use value and exchange value? In and for itself is value such as the general form in opposition to use value and exchange value as particular forms of it. Now, this general form, not unlike the general intellect, is some sort of desire to get to a kind of universal of some kind, something that's applicable in a lot more conditions. And that's kind of where Marx is doing. Does this have significance in economics? Use value presupposed even in simple exchange or barter. But here, where exchange takes place only for the reciprocal use of the commodity, the use value, i.e. the content, the natural particularity of the commodity has no such standing as an economic form. Its form, rather, is exchange value. So what's important to the economist is that, okay, well, there's these commodities, these things running around, and we think about exchange value, because that's kind of how we get it. You got to go to a store, you got to order online, you got to do all this kind of other kind of stuff. And what other contingencies are at work? Well, price, our budget, blah, 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 blah. So there's other things going on here. And yet they're not identical to questions of use. They're more related to exchange. The content apart from this form is irrelevant. It is not a content of the relation as a social relation, but does this content as such not develop into a system of needs and production? Does not use value as such enter into the form itself as a determinant of the form itself? For example, in the relation of capital and labor. If only exchange value as such plays a role in economics, then how could elements later enter which relate purely to use value? The price appears as a merely formal aspect of it. This is not in the slightest contradicted by the fact that exchange value is the predominant aspect. So, you sort of need to handle that there are many different concepts sort of moving around here. And this is that point that I was trying to make between, well, it's not all Department 1, it's Departments 1 and 2. But of course, use does not come to a halt because it is determined only by exchange, although, of course, it obtains its direction thereby. In any case, this is to be examined with exactitude in the examination of value, and not, as Ricardo does, to be entirely abstracted from, nor like the dull J.B. Say, who puffs himself up with a near presupposition of the word utility. Above all, it will and must become clear in the development of the individual sections to what extent use value exists, not only as a presupposed matter outside economics and its forms, that is because of individual taste, but to what extent it enters into it. So anyway, there's Proudhon, etc. Ricardo and Smith had distinguished between use value and exchange value simply to dismiss the former as of no economic significance. So, in other words, people who are the exemplars of capitalism are a little bit more concerned. They assume that people do stuff because it's useful or there's utility out there, but it has, as the marginalists would refer to it, as a kind of indifference. But that's a whole nother lecture. However, from Marx's Hegelian perspective, use value and exchange value were inseparable dialectical as aspects of the social unity, the commodity, which is itself central to the analysis of capitalism. far from being an economic irrelevance, use value in dialectical union with exchange value could actually be the key to a proper understanding of political economy. In other words, when you come up to something, you're not only thinking about its exchange value, that is, how much does it cost, and that's oversimplifying, of course, about price being equal to value, et cetera, et cetera. But you hypothesize, well, how am I going to use this thing? What am I going to use it for? Will I see it in combination with something else, or will it substitute or complement something else? So all these other microeconomic things are going on. Having discovered this dialectic so late in the development of its economics, Marx felt compelled to return to issues which he had previously considered solely in labor theory of value terms and to use the dialectic of commodities to provide a firmer foundation for his earlier views. This process of reconsideration dominates the Grundrisse and the theories of surplus value. The crucial use to which Marx put the dialectic of the commodity was to uncover the source of surplus value without having to begin with the premise that labor was the only source of value and without prior consideration of the distinction between labor power and labor. Note that that's an abstraction, right? That's the sort of first level abstraction. The best expression of this divination occurs not in the obscure and for so long unpublished Grundrisse, but in Capital itself. Now, the application. Marx began Capital by clearing intellectual cobwebs on the route to uncovering the source of surplus, criticizing explanation based on unequal exchange or increasing utility through exchange, then restating the classical axiom that exchange involves the transfer of equivalents. Note that this is 1867, so 22 decades have gone on, and Marx has tried to work through this, and that's why when you see the later documents, the 1864 to 67 documents, you see he's kind of worked through some of this stuff. Yet, at the same time, circulation based on the exchange of equivalents must be the starting point from which the source of surplus value is deduced. Marx put the dilemma superbly, and this is actually important. It's the thing that gets quoted in all kinds of Marxist documents. Not that it's the truth or whatever. It's just that he, after all his writing and all this editing and stuff, this is a useful paragraph. The conversion of money into capital has to be explained on the basis of the laws that regulate the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. Our friend Moneybags, who as yet is only an embryo capitalist, must buy his commodities at their value, must sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process must withdraw more value from circulation than he threw into it at starting. His development into a full-grown capitalist must take place, both within the sphere of circulation and without it. These are the conditions of the problem. So it is, center periphery, it's spheres, it's Department 1 and Department 2, it's all of those things. It's difference. It's things are moving, and that's kind of important. And that's a really important paragraph that gets repeated in all kinds of different contexts. He began the solution of this dilemma with a direct and powerful application of the dialectic of the commodity. If the exchange value of the commodity cannot be the source of surplus, then the dialectical opposite of value, use value, is the only possible source. Now, that's problematic, but here's the paragraph that goes with that. The exchange of value that occurs in the case of money intended to be converted into capital must take place in the commodity brought by the first act, M-C, but not in its value for equivalence or exchange. The commodity is paid for at its full value. We are, therefore, money and commodity. We're therefore forced to the conclusion that the change originates in the use value as such of the commodity, that is, its consumption. In order to be able to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags, same Moneybags, must be so lucky as to find within the sphere of circulation, Department 2, in the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. In other words, it's demand. That's, people want stuff. Marx then used the quantitative difference between the exchange value of labor power and its use value to uncover the source of surplus value in the transaction between worker and capitalist. So back to Marx again. the past labor that is embodied in the labor power and the living labor that it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it and its daily expenditure and work are two totally different things. The former determines the exchange value of the labor power. The latter is its use value. The fact that half a working day's labor is necessary to keep the laborer alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent him from working a whole 24-hour day, therefore, or 12-hour day. Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates in the labor process are two entirely different magnitudes. And this difference of the two values was what the capitalist had in view when he was purchasing the labor power. What really influenced him was the specific use value which this commodity possesses of being a source not only of value, but of more value than it has itself. This is a special service that the capitalist expects from labor power. And in this transaction, he acts in accordance with the eternal laws of the exchange of commodities. The seller of labor power, like the seller of any other commodity, realizes its exchange values and parts with its use value. At this point, Marx is triumphant. He's established the source of surplus value, and it's done so without any initial presumption that labor was the only source of value. See, he's gotten a way of doing it without overdetermining labor, not labor power, but labor, an achievement which had eluded his classical antecedents, that is, Ricardo, etc., Smith. But at this stage, all he had established was that labor was a source of value. To prove that it is the only source of value, he had to apply the same conceptual framework to the means of production and find that the presumption of the strict labor theory of value, that the means of production only transfer their value to the product, is confirmed. In this second endeavor, he failed. And that's kind of the key point of divergence. The contradiction in Capital Volume 1, Marx appeared to have successfully reached the conclusion that the means of production could not be a source of surplus value. However, he could only do so by contradicting a basic premise that the use value and the exchange value of a commodity are unrelated. In the course of this attempt, he advanced three propositions which fundamentally contravene his general approach to commodities. In other words, the thing that he starts it with is he re-problematizes the argument. In the case of the means of production, the purchaser makes use of their exchange value, not their use value. Number two, that their use value cannot exceed their exchange value. And three, that their use value somehow reappears in the use value of the commodities they help create. Marx began with the simple assertion that the means of production can transfer no more than their exchange value to the product. He next attempted to forge an equality between the exchange value and the use value of the means of production by equating the depreciation of a machine to its productive capacity. It's just an oversimplification. Value exists only in articles of unity. This is Marx talking. If therefore an article loses its utility, it also loses its value. The reason why means of production do not lose their value at the same time that they lose their use value is this. They lose in the labor process the original form of their use value, only to assume in the product the form of a new use value. Remember, we looked at this yesterday when we were yakking about chapter 6, old and new use value. Hence, it follows that in the labor process, the means of production transfer their value to the product only so far as, along with their use value, they also lose their exchange value. See, this is, it's over assuming things. They give up to the product that value alone, which they themselves lose as a means of production. Here, it's just, it's apples, oranges. It's just like he's trying to explain something which was always abstract. You start with labor power, which is, it's a capacity, it's a capability, it's an estimation, it's an expectation. It's not the thing itself. And then he gets stuck trying to say, well, it's old labor versus new labor or whatever. There are two erroneous propositions in this paragraph, while another is ambiguous. First, the final two sentences, which appear to link the transfer of value by the machine to its depreciation, are incorrect. See below. Secondly, the statement that the use value of the machine reappears in the use value of the product equates the use value of the machine to the utility enjoyed by the consumers who purchase the goods the machine produces. Now, in some cases, that's perhaps true, but it certainly is not in all cases. But the use value of a machine is specific to the capitalist purchaser of the machine only. By arguing that the use value of the machine reappears in the product, Marx is in fact contemplating the existence of abstract utility, with the usefulness of the machinery being transmuted into the usefulness of the commodities it produces. Anybody who has a plastic anything knows that that's just not the case. The ambiguous statement concerns the transfer of value by the means of production. Which of their two values do machines transfer, their exchange value or their use value? If Marx meant that they transfer their use value, then his sentence would be correct in terms of his analysis of commodities. But later, he makes it clear that by this expression, he meant that the means of production transfer not their use value, which is the case with the worker, but their exchange value. In the clearest illustration of the flaw in his logic, he states that over the life of a machine, its use value has been completely consumed, and therefore its exchange value completely transferred to the product. This amounts to the assertion that in the case of machinery and raw materials, what is consumed by the purchaser is not their use value, as it is with other commodities, but their exchange value. See, this question of what is embodied, as it were, congealed in a product is, problematized, because it's not clear in every instance. And in fact, when you have objects that have problematic shape or form, this is the first lecture I used to do, that is not necessarily available to you. This ambiguity reappears as Marx discusses the example of a machine which only lasts 6 days. He first states that the correct proposition that the machine transfers its use value to the product, and then equates it to its exchange value. He says that if a machine lasts 6 days, then on the average, it loses each day 1/6 of its use value, and therefore parts with 1/6 of its value to the daily product. Initially, he draws the correct, if poorly stated, inference that means of production never transfer more value to the product than they themselves lose during the labor process by the destruction of their own use value. However, the ambiguity between exchange value and use value is strong, and his conclusion makes the incorrect fork, that is, and moves in the wrong way. Stating his conclusion rather than more succinctly than his reasoning, he says the maximum loss of value that they, that is, machines, can suffer in the process is plainly limited by the amount of the original value with which they came into the process, or in other words, by the labor time necessary for their production. Now, however useful a given raw material or a machine or other means of production may be, though it may cost 150 pounds, yet it cannot, under any circumstances, add to the value of the product more than 150 pounds. Essentially, Marx reached the result that the means of production cannot generate surplus value by confusing depreciation or the loss of value by a machine with value creation. The truisms that the maximum amount of value that a machine can lose in it is its exchange value, and that a machine's exchange value will fall to zero only when its use value has been completely exhausted, were combined to conclude that the value machine adds in production is equivalent to the exchange value it loses in depreciation, which is an oversimplification, pretty clear, but he needed to sort of try and get the math to work, and that's kind of why he gets stuck in his arithmetic. With the value added by a machine equated to value lost, no net value is transferred to the product, and therefore only labor can be a source of surplus value. So this is just bad logic in that sense. While the argument may appear plausible, in reality it involves a confusion of two distinct attributes of a machine, that is, its cost, that is, its exchange value, and its usefulness, which is use value. So, from a Marxian perspective, depreciation is the writing off of the original exchange value of a machine over its productive life. Consequently, the maximum depreciation that a machine can suffer is its exchange value. As it wears out, both its residual value and its usefulness will diminish, and both will terminate at the same time. Now, however, it does not follow that the usefulness, that is, the value creating capacity of the machine, is equal to its cost, its depreciation. Although a capitalist will write off the latter completely only when the former has been extinguished, the two aspects are nevertheless completely different and unrelated. There is no reason why the value lost by the machine should be equivalent to the value added. An analogy with labor highlights the fallacy involved in equating these two magnitudes. If workers receive a subsistence wage, and if the working day exhausts the capacity to labor, then it could be argued that in a day, a worker depreciates by an amount equivalent to the subsistent wage, the exchange value of labor power. However, this depreciation is not the limit of the amount of value that can be added by a worker in a day's labor, the use value of labor. Value added is unrelated to and greater than value lost. If it were not, there could be no surplus. This is the key point. And this is where it all, people who are overdetermined relative to labor, the labor theory of value, this is where it breaks down because you're still dealing with this question of labor. And yes, it is an abstraction called labor power, but it's not sort of dealt with in that, there's this weird kind of switching that goes on because you're committed to, theories of classes, the working class, blah, 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 that, you want to make that coherent. And in fact, it's a bad analogy in that sense. Marx's dialectic provides the axiomatic basis on which to discern between value added and depreciation, and thus reject the identification of value creating capacity with value lost. As discussed above, depreciation can be equated to exchange value, while a machine's contribution to production is its use value. According to Marx's analysis of commodities, these should be two different magnitudes, since for all commodities, the two aspects in no way enter into relation with each other. Marx, 1857. Marx did, in fact, reach this conclusion in the Grundrisse. In the midst of a mass of arithmetic exploring how machinery could reduce the price of a product, thus giving an advantage to the capitalist who introduces it and yet resulting in a lowering of the rate of profit, Marx suggested precisely the method that he should have used to apply his dialectic of commodities to the question of the value productivity of machinery. It also has to be postulated, this is Marx speaking, quote, it also has to be postulated, which was not done before, that the use value of the machine significantly is greater than its value. That is, the valuation in the service of production is not proportional to its increasing effect on production, unquote. Here, Marx specifically refers to the use value of a machine being greater than its value, and in contrast to his discussion of depreciation and capital, disassociated the productivity of a machine from its depreciation. The use value of a machine will differ from its exchange value, and as with labor, we can assume that its use value will be significantly greater than its value. In practice, this will mean that the amount it loses in depreciation will be significantly less than the amount it contributes to the value of output, and it will, with labor, be a source of surplus value. Unfortunately, Marx never developed this postulate. Marx's later developments of this dialectic, as it relates to value creation, tarnished rather than polished the tool, obscuring the fundamental contradiction it uncovered in his labor theory of value. The quantification of use value in his algebraic and numeric explorations of value creation, Marx compounded his previous logical errors by using the same magnitude for the exchange value and use value of the means of production. This is the Ricardian problem. While using different magnitudes for the exchange value and use value of labor power, the inputs to a productive process are heterogeneous labor and a heterogeneous collection of goods. This is going to be hard for you to follow, probably because I'm rambling on here. Given the input side of the productive process as C, big C equals small c plus V, C, lower c, is clearly the exchange value of the means of production, and V is the exchange value of labor power, right? Constant and variable. The output is a commodity, thus depreciated capital equipment, and the value equation, C prime equals C plus V plus S, quantifies this gross output. This equation is of itself unproblematic since it states that production generates a surplus. The difficulties arise when portions of that net output are attributed to the labor power and the commodity inputs. Marx's claim that the surplus S is proportional to V and unrelated to C describes V plus S as the use value of labor and C as the use value of the means of production. Now, Marx made the former identification explicitly on numerous occasions, including the passage in Capital, where he first reveals the source of surplus value. There are numerous other passages where the use value of labor is identified with similar concepts such as surplus value, productive consumption, etc. Now, while his characterization of C, small c, as the use value of the means of production was never so definitive, Marx nonetheless was explicit that the quantitative measure of a machine's contribution to production was its use value, not its exchange value. So far as constant capital enters into the production of commodities, is not its use value, it's not its exchange value, but its use value alone, which matters which matters. The assistance rendered by a machine to, say, 3 laborers does not depend on its value, but on its use value as a machine. Thus, the contribution of the means of production to the value of output is their use value. However, the quantity which Marx gave for the use value of machine was small c, which is also its exchange value. The identification of c as both the exchange and the use value, the exchange value and the use value of the means of production, was a feature of every numerical example given by Marx in all of his economic works. In attributing a quantity to this use value, Marx essentially continued Ricardo's implicit practice of treating capital's contribution to output as identical to its input. So you can see that he's already, he compounds his errors. The following table summarizes Marx's argument in volume 1 on the source of surplus value and the use value, exchange value dialectic. So exchange value, labor power is V, commodity input C, use value V plus S, commodity input C. Are they different? From a labor power point of view, yes, they are. From the commodity input point of view, no. Is surplus generated? Yes. From a commodity point of view, it's no. Is it consistent with Ricardo? Yes, indeed it is, as labor power and commodity inputs. Is it consistent with dialectic? No, not from the view of a commodity, but yes, from a labor power point of view. The problem with this customary quantification is that it contradicts Marx's oft-repeated proposition that use value and exchange value are unrelated. So, in other words, there's a claim for a relationship doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because Marx got there, but then he sort of fell back, as it were, into this other thing in order to get the math to work. The central point of this paper is that in the Grundrisse, Marx transformed the classical distinction between exchange value and use value and the classical proposition that use value plays no role in determining exchange value into a dialectical foundation for its economics. Prior to this pivotal logical advance, there was no problem with Marx continuing to follow Ricardo on the issue of value productivity of machinery. Marx simply made explicit in his theory a concept which is arguably implicit in Ricardo. The assertion that labor is the only source of value could be maintained, albeit with all the technical problems of a labor theory of value. But his development of the dialectic between exchange value and use value makes this claim logically untenable. The axiom that use value plays no role in determining exchange value means that in the sphere of consumption, use value and exchange value are incommensurable in contrast to the neoclassical schema, which makes utility and price commensurable through the devices of marginal utility and marginal cost. This is why it's easier to teach neoclassical economics, because some things are already assumed to be identical, when in fact, and even to go to Marx, they're not. And it is this Department 1, Department 2 division, which is actually the most important element, which Marx doesn't fully explicate in volume 1 because, volume 2 and volume 3 are constructed after his death, and it's Engels, and maybe Engels wasn't real clear about it. Engels was clear about it. I think he just, whatever. It's inattentiveness, let's put it that way. In the sphere of production, where both exchange value and use value are quantitative, it means that they're just normally, although not necessarily different. Yet to argue that the quantified use value of the means of production is the same as their quantified exchange value is to argue that in the case of the means of production, exchange value and use value are identical. Finally, the conclusion, right? The conclusion that labor cannot be the only source of value has long ceased to be novel. As well as being fundamental to neoclassical economics, it has been asserted explicitly or implicitly by, amongst others, and these are important names, Sraffa, Steedman, Bose, Hodgson, Romer, Wolf, yes, our Wolf. No, actually, I think it's the other Wolf. But anyway, Bandyopadhyaya and Carling. What is novel about this proof is that it has been reached using Marx's fundamental logic. It is thus rather more difficult for those who wish to maintain a labor theory of value to oppose, since in the past it was the last refuge of defenders of the labor theory has been that Marx said it was so. I hope that I have shown that, this is Steve Keen, had Marx properly applied his own logic, he would have said that it was not. Another difference is that since these conclusions flow naturally from Marx's own reasoning, those parts of the analysis which do not depend on labor being the only source of value remain intact. Other critics of labor theory of value would abandon Marx's historical analysis, his use of the dialectic concept of value itself. Clearly, these foundations are in fact strengthened by these results. So that's the conclusion here, is that Keynes has an ecumenical goal here to show that, well, the original logic is fine. Something happened, and there was like weird backtracking, whether it was arithmetic or editing or something. The fundamental idea is still there. That there are concrete and abstract divisions, that they present themselves in ways that accommodate both qualitative and quantitative elements. It's not problematic. It's just a different level of analysis. And in fact, if you move from Department 1 to Department 2 and you talk about, the spatial and temporal changes, this David Harvey sort of stuff and all this other stuff, it doesn't really contradict the original kind of sensibility about it. It's just that when you start reifying certain variables, you get into the weeds, and it's those weeds that allow people to say, well, your math is bad because you assumed certain things that, while useful for developing certain lines of theory, that is, assumptions made by marginal utility analysis, etc., they don't work in reality. The trade-offs are not perfect in that sense. Similarly, his comments on the reproduction process, the circuits of capital, and the cyclical nature of capitalism are in no way affected. So that's kind of where we are now. Conversely, his conclusions, which depend upon labor being the only source of value, are in general overturned. Chief among those are the transformation of value into prices and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, there are decades spent on the rate of profit to fall stuff. The transformation problem is derived from the propositions that labor is the only source of surplus value, and that the rate of surplus value is uniform across industries, whereas profit is proportional to the capital expended on both labor power and commodity inputs. Were these premises valid, then there would be a divergence between rates of surplus value and rates of profit when the ratio of commodity inputs to labor inputs varied between industries. However, the proof that every input to production can be a source of surplus value establishes that the rate of surplus value should tend towards uniformity across industries, for the same reason that rates of profit should tend to be uniform, capitalist competition. Therefore, there is no a priori reason why issues pertaining exclusively to production itself, Department 1, such as the ratio of capital to labor, should cause a divergence between rates of surplus value and rates of profit. There is thus no reason why a higher capital labor ratio than average should be associated with a lower rate of surplus value than average. No technical problem in converting values into prices of production, and no reason why prices should systematically diverge from values or rates of surplus value from rates of profit solely on the differences in capital intensity. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall suffers a similar fate. This tendency, like the transformation problem itself, was founded on the proposition that labor was the only source of value, and that there was a tendency over time for the ratio of capital to labor, measured in value terms, to rise. Since surplus can be garnered from all inputs to production, there is no reason why an increase in the ratio of commodity labor inputs should lead to a decline in the overall rate of surplus. Using Marx's own logic, this confirms Ian Steedman's judgment from a Pierre Strothian perspective that the transformation problem is a pseudo-problem, a chimera. Indeed, the entire dispute between Marxians and Strothians, that is the neo-Ricardians, can itself be judged a chimera, since Marx's theory of value, in fact, provides the philosophical foundation for an absolute theory of value, consonant with Strothian analysis, in which commodities in general, in a system of commodity production, are regarded as the source of surplus value. Further development of the method discussed in this paper should provide many worthwhile additions to the intellectual weaponry of Marxian analysis. In this new tradition, which can exist cooperatively with Strothian and Kaleckian economics, and it's important there because Kalecki is a key element in this, while containing the superior concepts of dialectics and value, it should be to Marx's credit that he provided the analysis by which the labor theory of value could be transcended and labor and commodities together regarded as the joint sources of value. Amen. As I said, this compresses the arguments of several decades of arguing on the question of value, all in one place, and is worth reading because it's relatively simple. And The notes and others, refer to this, and I think it's useful to make these distinctions among versions of how we think about capital, because you have to explain it to somebody. If it should be incumbent on one, if you're going to explain, why things are so screwed up, that how certain elements are being described is going to, the fundamental assumptions have to be made clear. So that's all that I have to say about that. Let's see what the chat says. Fixed his mistake. Uh, yes. Yes. Yeah, the good question. Who made the spindle? And that is part of the kind of argumentation that goes on. Is you talk not only about the machinery but also some of the ancillary elements of it. In fact, the spindle, of course, is a key element in speeding the whole process up. Um, the flying shuttle or whatever. Let's see, shipping container, Mr. Moneybags, yes, is not my friend. Not everyone gets that idea. They think they're capitalists when they dumbass libertarians. Yes, indeed, there are plenty of dumbass libertarians. Somehow they think that work is interchangeable with the same salary everywhere, and it's clearly is not, and that's the real problem. It is the real problem essentially. Um, let's see, we get screwed more often than every paycheck. Yes, indeed. And then robots, yes. Well, there's an interesting way you could argue robots, and in fact, it probably gets down ultimately to software, but that's another story. Blah, blah, blah. Workers also care about whether their workplace gets to survive, which is sadly often misused, and indeed it is, misused by their employers. Uh, and yes, the new passport. Yes, there are tacky designs. When I got my new passport, I don't know, it's amazing that there is an American design, and when you see bureaucratic materials, you often see it as weirdly constructed. Similarly, you can take a look at the new White House front page, its web page. It's on the one hand simple. On the other hand, there's a structural resemblance to Trump's merchandise pages. But anyway, that's a different question. All right, I think I've covered all the stuff here, and so we can. Uh, I may have been allocated. Have I been allocated the live stream tools? No, I haven't. So I'll ask Joe to. Nancy, question.
Yeah, I don't know if my question is pertinent to anything, but can surplus value be transformed so that if you have a productive enterprise and somebody might take it as profit, the surplus value might be taken as profit. Is it surplus value whether it's returned as an investment in equipment?
Yes. Yes, it is.
So is it always surplus value if it's paying workers, if it's just divided amongst workers, if it's
no, it can always be plowed back in, but the idea of surplus is that it's not pure profit. That's the point. Profit is only a component. They're not perfectly identical. Let's put it that way.
So it's a surplus if it's over the cost of goods and labor that comes back.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No, I'm glad I could clear that up because it is a sticking point for many people.
Good question. Yeah.
Larry, you have a question?
Well, it's a good question. My question
go ahead.
was about maybe looking at something like a shipping container could help explicate it a little bit.
Oh yes, in fact, yes.
was thinking of, it's like when it's on a ship and it's got a bunch of goods in it, that's one use. But then if it gets discarded and somebody uses it as their storage container, that's something else, right? Or if it drops off the ship and ends up in the bottom of the ocean and turns into a little reef, that's another thing.
Oh, yes, indeed. But one of the realities of it, one would think also, is that aside from being a shipping container, it also contains capital of one kind. And its speed, the speed in the supply chain is also an interesting problem. Distance and speed in the supply chain is also problematic. Prices of things will go up,
Oh, like if you have only so many containers, but you need to get more than that many containers worth of stuff somewhere, kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, that's part of it. Yes, absolutely. Or if it gets delayed, or if it's perishable, because there are perishable things often in containers. Now, normally, or I don't want to characterize it as that, but there's stuff that cannot go in containers that are you have to use a different form of transport. People want their sushi, right? So you have to air freight whatever fish from one side of the country to the other side in order to get the sushi, right?
Not me.
Indeed. So yeah, there's that.
Cool.
Okay. Let me Joe, you can cut the YouTube. I hope this doesn't disrupt your other activity.